Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo, founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory and investments firm focused on helping to address the complex development challenges we face in Africa. And today we're excited to discuss one of the most consequential questions in development, which is impact investing actually delivering any impact? Over the last 2 decades, this field, impact investing, has gone from that niche idea discussed at conferences and philanthropic circles to more than $1.5 trillion industry, according to the Global Impact Investing Network. Across the continent, the case for impact capital has never seemed more urgent. Governments are fiscally constrained, traditional overseas development assistance is under pressure, and the scale of our problems, poverty, unemployment, inclusion or exclusion, continue to expand. So, it's not these are not problems that just public resources would be able to address on their own. But as the impact investing field has grown, so have the questions. So what actually counts as impact? Who defines it? How do we measure it? What matters? And are there any risks that impact investing is becoming just a mere language or a way of signaling virtue without being held accountable to any real outcomes? In Africa, this is not an abstract debate. Access to finance remains the single most significant challenge that enterprises have. Social enterprises in particular continue to struggle to find the patient, risk-tolerant capital they need to scale. The gap between rhetorics of impact and the reality facing enterprises is wide, and that gap is what we intend to examine today. To help me or help us walk through these and other questions, pleased to have someone who sits at the center of the ecosystem in Nigeria and indeed West Africa, because her work expands to Ghana and other parts. Etemere Glover is the Chief Executive Officer of the Impact Investors Foundation. She played a pivotal role in establishing Nigeria's National Advisory Board for Impact Investing and has spent years working in this space and interfacing with investors, development capital, development finance institutions, and policymakers to move impact capital from just mere intentions to outcome. Before her work in impact, Etemere built deep expertise in retail, corporate, and investment banking, including at FBN Quest and Zenith Bank in Nigeria. And she brings that commercial rigor, to the field that frankly needs more of that level of rigor. Etemere, very warm welcome to Development Discourse.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Let's start with kind of framing the field. If you've spent years inside Nigeria's impact investing ecosystem, designing it, convening stakeholder engagements, pressing for policy change. When you step away from it, when you step back and look at where the field is today in Nigeria and across Africa, what is your overall assessment, vis-a-vis what it's defined to do? What is your assessment of where we are today?
Thank you very much, Patrick, for first and foremost having this timely discussion. And to this question you asked, when I step back and look at where we are, I'm filled with excitement. Because when we started in 2019, I was also asking myself that, what did I get myself into and what are we doing? There were questions, around impact investments, misunderstanding, people's perceptions, even investors who claim to be impact investors really didn't understand the concept. So there was that lack of clarity even for regulators, policymakers, government, when engaging, they were not quite certain what impact investment was. There were not enough instruments, sophisticated impact instrument at the time. Blended finance was just coming up at that early time, but how to blend finance? Blended finance was distorting the markets and not making it commercially viable for commercial investors who wanted to invest to compete with very cheap funds that were coming into the market. So all sorts of things were playing, lack of coordination. So stepping into the field, understanding what was going on. But one thing I learned was that impact investment was new. That's the first thing to point out. Secondly, it was evolving. More people were coming in, were curious about a better way to deploy capital that could achieve both financial returns and social and environmental impact. So we're looking for places where impact investment had worked and how to mirror what was working in other markets. Now, looking today and seeing how sophisticated the impact investment has now become, the proliferation of instruments from the social impact bonds, venture debts, which was something that really came up last year in terms of deployment, more impact investors who are now looking for impact first opportunities than looking at profit first opportunities. Governments now taking leadership in some areas by mobilizing de-risking financing. And luckily, we now have local institutional investors coming into the place, into the space. So it's an exciting time. We've grown. More ecosystem builders are coming into the space to help with the coordination and to help with the facilitation and flow of capital. So standing here and looking back, we've really come a long way. But is there still miles and miles ahead of us? Yes, but we're not where we were when we first started.
And I'm sure we're going to get to that, in our journey this afternoon. But even stepping back a little bit, how do you define impact investing? Especially, how do you differentiate it from like philanthropy or maybe ESG and so many of these other terms that we have gotten comfortable with, as ways to address people at the bottom of the pyramid? How is impact investing different? What is the specific space it sits within?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So I'll just define it quite broadly, as was defined by the Global Impact Investing Network, and then go into the specifics for clarity, because where we are losing meaning is in contextualizing what does impact investment mean for us, particularly in Africa and Nigeria. So quite broadly speaking, impact investing are investments made with the intention to generate social and environmental impact, measurable social and environmental impact alongside financial returns. In the context of Nigeria and Africa, we will be looking at outcomes such as access to finance for SMEs. At the continent, it's valued about 331 billion US dollars, and in Nigeria, it's about 158 million dollars. Access to finance for businesses, creating jobs, not just job quality jobs, improvement in livelihood, access to finance and opportunities for women, etc. Those are the kind of outcomes we want to see happen. Addressing social services that are lacking in Nigeria in healthcare, education, and agriculture. So those are the kinds of outcomes that impact investment should be generating for us, in addition to financial returns. So when we talk about impact investing, there are things that I would like us to have at the back of our minds: the intentionality or the intent to make measurable, positive impact, whether they are changes that occur at societal levels for people or environmentally, that must be clearly stated with every investment. So that's what differentiates it from every other investment. Secondly, those positive changes that occur at impact is long-term, but across the theory of change, what are the changes happening from inputs, from the deployment of capital, from activities, results that are happening up till the long-term impacts that you want to see happen? For instance, job creation, livelihood, and what does that translate for the average Nigerian? So those are the kind of things that we must measure with our impact capital. Thirdly, returns. So this is where impact investment is different from philanthropy. There must be a financial return. It can be below market rate, it can be market rate, it can be above market rate, but there must be that financial returns. So there's no trade-off when it comes to impact investment. Impact investment seeks to bring in that additionality. So asking myself questions, will this impact occur if my $1 or $1 doesn't go into this investment? So these are some criteria that we look to see that really distinguish impact investments from every other kind of investment. And let me touch on environmental, social, and governance that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So ESG investing is great. It's a great starting point, but we look at ESG as a risk managing system or tool, whereby the idea there is to manage material, financial, environmental, social, and governance risk that can affect the enterprise value of the shareholders or the investors or the owners. So the strategy here is to minimize or to eliminate those risks so that your shareholder or your investor's value doesn't go low or depreciate. However, impact investment is very intentional. It's contributing, and the goal is to make positive and measurable impact, whereas the other is used as a risk management tool. And I'll give you an example, so just to drive this home. So take, for instance, and this is a real case study, a Nigerian company in a cement industry, right, receives a sustainability link bond or loan of 500 million. And that comes after committing to reducing their emission by 27%, which is great. It's a great ESG investment. But the question I want to ask here is that we all know that cement is a major environmental polluter, accounting for about 8% of the global emission, right? So if you're looking at that, that sounds great. We are reducing CO2, but you are also contributing to CO2 emission.
Exactly.
Right? So impact investment looks at the long-term value creation, environmental impact, social impact, as well as economic impact, and to transition, that kind of investment to an alternative, eco-friendly building material away from cement that contributes positively to the earth, resources, rather than reducing the negative impact and creating jobs across the value chain. So that's the difference between ESG and impact investment. I've touched on philanthropy. Philanthropy is strategic capital, but because it's 100% impact and 0% financial return, which kinds of sacrifices the scalability of that kind of resources.
Fantastic. Now, there's this recurrent critique that impact in measurement in the space is really weak, right? Most investors in the space report mostly on outputs or, rather than outcomes. And the communities where the impact is supposed to be felt, sometimes they are not even involved or engaged in defining what that impact should be. And therefore, it kind of affects the way or impacts the way we define success or what success really looks like. How fair is this critique, and what would genuine, rigorous impact measurement and accountability look like in the Nigerian context?
Thank you very much for that question. In the Nigerian context and in anywhere in the world starts with that intention. So what do I want to achieve with my capital? and building an investment thesis around your strategy. We call it, in my space, the theory of change.
Theory
And
of
the
change.
theory of change has several levels. It starts with the resources I'm putting in, including my investments, right? The assets I'm putting into sweat to work to achieve, results in the long term. So the next thing you get are those activities that you carry out. So you want to start putting a framework in place to start measuring changes that are occurring across all the levels of the theory of change, from the very inputs to the output, which is your activities and your results that you want to have. And then you go to the intermediate outcomes and long-term outcomes, and then your impact. So when you start tracking all of these changes, impact is long-term. So I always like to say that requires long-term capital for you to be patient enough to see that change occur. So you start to track all of those things, and it's resources. So what I want to just maybe deviate away from the thinking is that what I see happen is that people say that they are doing impact investment and are not doing impact investment. They do not have the right models to track impact investment. There are tools that you can use, but it starts with that intentionality and then carrying out actions, to help you with achieving your goals. So it's not impact washing, it's not whitewashing, it's not box ticking. It's an intentional corporate behavioral change that is required for you to see that achievement happen. And impact investment, impact measurement and management, it is not cheap. It must be paid for. But it is a strategy, a very intentional strategy that investors, enterprise use to show progress that they are achieving towards sustainable development, and it accounts for something, right? So your fund managers, your stakeholders, what we're seeing now happening globally, the global trend is that people are asking, what are you doing with your $1? What are you doing with your investment? What positive changes are you making? How are you mitigating risk in such a way that your entire stakeholders can trust that you have their interest? So that global trend is really forcing the way business is done. And so it requires every investor, every consumer, even governments, to have impact at the heart of what they do. So what it will take for a country like Nigeria to measure it's that it will cost, and somebody has got to pay for it, and the willingness stakeholders to commit towards doing that. And thirdly, we're seeing recently with the International Sustainability Standard Board, the Nigeria really raised up their hands to ensure that every entity by 2028 should be reporting their impact. And they created a roadmap for that, the ISL, the Federal Reporting Council of Nigeria. So which means that everyone needs to start getting ready to report the impacts that they are making. So it's not something that's going to be voluntary by 2020, 2030. It is going to be mandatory.
Interesting. Let me shift gears a little bit. One of the biggest challenges that early stage enterprises have is access to patients, maybe concessional, but definitely loss tolerant capital, right? But there seems to be a mismatch between that type of capital and what is available. What do you think is responsible for that mismatch, and who within the ecosystem should be tasked with trying to solve it?
That's a very interesting question, Patrick. To reflect on the mismatch, there are several factors that are causing the mismatch. There is demand, I should add.
Yes.
And sometimes the question is, do we have the pipeline to absorb the demand? And who is responsible for that? I'll start at this level. Reflecting at countries where impact investing has been institutionalized and the role of different actors who are interacting, from the government to the investors to private sector participation, ecosystem builders, is that interaction helps to facilitate and unlock capital moving from where capital is to where it ought to go. And the roles of intermediaries to do that, all of those things must be there for capital to move. And when capital is not moving, we want to ask ourselves, what is happening? So at different levels in Nigeria, firstly, we have a low pipeline of investment-ready businesses, right? I've spoken to investors in Nigeria across Africa, and they say that we have capital, but we are not able to deploy because of the low pipeline of investment-ready businesses. And what we see happen is the same capital moves around the same opportunities, the same businesses, the same funds. So there's a question of pipeline development. That is why we need accelerators, incubators, impact investing, ecosystem builders like IIF to play their role in preparing, in identifying firstly, and preparing the pipeline of businesses so monies can move. And another level, which is something that we are addressing at the Impact Investors Foundation and National Advisory Board, is the intermediation side. Monies are not moving at the speed and velocity to get to frontline enterprises because we do have a narrow pipeline of local fund managers who have the skills, track record, competencies to raise funds and then deploy capital to frontline social enterprises. Then at another level is policy. It is important that we have policies to unlock capital, particularly from local institutional investors, and they must play a role in investing in the real sectors and funding our SMEs. Our SMEs contribute quite significantly to the GDP across Africa and in creating jobs. But access to finance is by far one of the major barriers to enable SMEs to play that very pivotal role. So when we have policies signaling the market where capital should go, and with all of this interacting, monies will move. Businesses will get the support that they require to become investment ready. Intermediaries will mobilize the capital to them, and policy, will be the one to strengthen that infrastructure. As we are seeing in markets where impact investing has been institutionalized, is that the government plays a very important role, one of many roles, either as a market facilitator, capital actually reaching social enterprises as a result of the role that government played in such situations.
So let me stay with this point for a few minutes. I like that you put the responsibility at the feet of the IIF that you run, the National Advisory Board on Impact Investing that you helped set up and you're an active member in. I also like that you talked about policy, and I know that your organization and the NABI worked on a wholesale impact investment fund for Nigeria that was supposed to address many of these things that you talked about, including build out the intermediary space, et cetera, et cetera. Why hasn't that kind of kicked in as designed? What is it that the design missed? Or what are you learning that could be done differently? Are you picking up any sense from other African countries around the world of how we could structure differently to really unlock, the latent energy or demand that's in the space?
Thank you, Patrick, for that great question, for putting me on the spot. But I'll speak to it, and I'm going to drag you in because you're also part of the design. So don't exonerate yourself at all from this. We didn't get anything wrong in the design, Patrick. We wanted the government to play a role as a market participant, as we see in other countries, Malaysia, Canada, so many other countries in the United Kingdom. So it wouldn't be too much to ask the government to legitimize a fund of this nature, and a fund that addresses challenges that are in alignment with our then National Development Plan, which ended in December last year. So there's really nothing wrong. The government should be providing de-risking capital, particularly in testing models like an impact fund. And this fund, we didn't say is purely 100% grants. It's not. It is not. It is a commercial fund which will deliver returns to the investors, including the government, but they must provide the anchor de-risking financing to bring in that legitimacy to raise capital from the pension funds. And the pension fund industry is one area where we can have long-term growth financing that we need to scale impact. We've seen the model in the United Kingdom and how that has catalyzed the social investment space from, I think, an investment of about 400 million to now trillions of pounds, and unlocking the growth of local fund managers. We contextualized it in Nigeria, speaking with different stakeholders and saying this is what we want to do. But that government role, which is very catalytic, kind of has been a bottleneck. But I'm glad the government is saying that, is not saying that they are not interested, but they are constrained. So we're going back to see what other partners can come on board as anchor financiers to help us crowd in the pension fund, because the pension funds must really contribute, not only the pension funds, the institutional, all institutional investors, from your sovereign wealth to your insurance, even your retail money banks must put in money, long-term money towards, impact investment. But speaking about the model for the impact investment fund is between the pension, now speaking to catalytic capital providers, really excited about this, and pension funds to blend with the first close about 50 million, and then we'll start mobilizing capital. What is very exciting about this fund, and Patrick, you touched about it, is that we want this fund to be sustainable. We want this fund to build the market. And one way we can build the market so that capital really gets to where it needs to go beyond just Lagos and Abuja is to strengthen our local and intermediary actors. So with partners like the GSG Impact and the Gates Foundation, we've received 1.5 million pounds for technical assistance financing to do the market building work. Also in partnership with the DFC, the US fund, to support our work in terms of doing the market building part of our work. So this is where we are on things. Really exciting, but the goal is still far, but we're getting there.
Fantastic. And so, again, it's good that you mentioned the development finance institutions, and often they're positioned as maybe at the catalytic layer, and they're supposed to kind of help crowd in commercial capital. But there's a deeper question, right? About alignment and how well, the impact capital they're bringing tracks national or even subnational development priorities like job creation, poverty reduction, etc. What's the best role for like the development finance institutions? And to bring it to more practical sense, right? I know that in the design of the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund, the Nigerian government was supposed to put in $100 million to unlock a fund that would grow to $1 billion. The government is saying they're constrained in some way or the other. Could this be a place where the DFIs come in and take on that, so the investment that the government was supposed to make, unlock the private sector funds, and that would be the best place for them to sit? It'd be the best layer for the DFIs to sit, to really catalyze the capital creation that then goes to the private sector? Or is it best to be doing like the technical assistance bit? What, in your view, is the best position for them to be more impactful?
Great question. I'm reflecting because they can play various roles. But let me say this point so that I don't forget it. Patrick, we cannot keep looking at foreign capital to build our market. That's what we've been doing for yonks. And Africa cannot scale with foreign capital. And that's one of the lessons that we have learned. Local capital has to participate in the space. That's why we designed the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund as a place where local capital will take the leadership. So that we have to now start looking, because local capital is not taking the leadership, particularly from the public sector. we wanted the public sector to catalyze the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund. Yes, the reality is that they are constrained. We have to move forward. So where the DFIs are coming to bail us out is taking that catalytic position to crowd in local pension funds. But they are looking at local capital matching with them. And that's how we can scale development. It's our local capital because one is in local currency, it's long term. We understand the markets. We can send signal to where capital should go so capital can play. But that caveat is that over-reliance on foreign capital will not grow our market.
Interesting. And I agree with you, by the way. So there's, and you touched on this point I'm about to make. There's a growing interest in blended finance as a bridge between concessional and commercial capital. But the evidence on whether blended finance actually de-risks investments for underserved markets is mixed at best. One is not sure if it is not simply subsidizing returns for capital that on its own would have come into the space anyway. Now, what's your reading of the blended finance experiment within the Nigeria context? Is it delivering as designed, or is it just another nice sounding concept that we haven't been able to really implement as designed?
Thanks, Patrick. What we see happening with blended finance is that it's at two levels. One level, it is delivering the intended results that it is meant to have. We've seen a few of those funds, case in point, infra-credit, blending finance with DFIs and local pension fund, and that really has scaled. At another level, we see blended finance distorting the market where it becomes really too cheap that your commercial investors cannot, compete with this. Another level too is that blended finance is not really bringing that additionality that capital should bring and directing it towards places and people that require the impact that should be occurring. So this is where blended finance tends to distort the market. And we've seen a lot of that in time past with some of the government's initiative. I don't know if I'm safe to mention some of them on this program.
Yeah, why not?
That, just to touch on some of the government ones, like the Anchor Borers program, and several of them that it appeared that commercial investors, even the NISA one, as good meaning, as good intention as those programs were, they were not helping the market. They were distorting our market. And the lesson for us here is that we must discuss with stakeholders before we blend. And then ask them, where do they come in? There's so much that government capital should be doing. It should be the risk scale. We cannot be relying on guarantees, but we must ensure that we have the right balance where we stop and where commercial capital takes over. In such a situation, that is when we can scale. So blended finance is great. It helps the market, but we cannot rely on blended finance. We need to know when to stop blended finance.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk a bit about social enterprises that operate within Africa. Most of them face really specific and well-documented constraints. And you spoke about some of those constraints earlier on in this conversation. Unpredictable regulatory environment, infrastructure deficits, increasingly currency risks, although Nigeria's currencies started to stabilize a little bit, but definitely weak institutional support. And you talked about it with the intermediaries, etc. When you're advising social enterprise, trying to become investment ready, what are the places you tell them to focus first? What's the most common reasons why many of these deals fall apart before they close? What's the most important reason or constraint why the funds that you've repeatedly said are available, why aren't they finding their way to the businesses and enterprises that need them? What's the most critical issues that these businesses need to address?
So many, I don't know where to start from, but the most critical, so many really, because when I think about all the businesses that we've tried to support and those that scaled and those that didn't scale, the difference is around governance. We see businesses that have stronger governance, having the better bargaining power in terms of the confidence that exudes from that kind of structure. So governance is very key. Another is poor identification of the opportunity, right? You are not able to articulate the problem that you are trying to solve is really a problem that we see in businesses communicating what they are trying to do to an investor. And once you're not able to even do that to your immediate investors, question that I'm asking, how do you now start thinking about commercial investors is one of the things that we try to help business to put in a better proposition. Thing too is the fact that sometimes they're not ready. You have to go through a structured life cycle as a business. You first start with your family and friends, but you have to put in your money first. And then your family and friends, you bootstrap. You want to show that you are generating revenue. You are proving your concept. After proving your concept, you now meet early investors like angel investors. And we have several of those networks now on the continent, from ABAN, Africa Business Angels, to Lagos Angel Network, South Angel Network, and Rising Tide for Women. So many of those angel situation that gives really low ticket sizes that can be absorbed by your average businesses. So that is when you now start positioning your business for more matured investment from your VC. So your angel might want to exit partially or fully into a venture capital fund that gives early stage investment. Then you now want to go to your private equity. But sometimes they miss some of these steps and they want to go to your big, investors, and that wouldn't work. And there's also the lack of education, financial education, in not knowing what kinds of opportunity to pursue, what kind of investor to partner with. And for lack of knowledge, sometimes you see businesses wanting to hold 100% of equity. So 100% times zero is zero. So you understand that debt financing sometimes is not the best financing to help you scale. So lack of education is another very important deterrent that really limits our local businesses from being ready, to really scale. So I'll just stop here, but these are some things that I see while I engage with businesses, at our level on the continent and across Africa.
Who's addressing that lack of?
Africa.
Yeah, who's addressing that lack of information today? What are they doing? Where are the gaps? What could be done differently? And I say this because, we move around quite a bit at the subnationals, and we see people trying to solve a development challenge, one way or the other, using market-facing solutions. But sometimes they're not in the information flow on how to present themselves, how to package the ideas, how to talk to impact investors. Indeed, many of them don't even know that impact investors exist. Who's trying to bridge that information gap? What are they doing currently, and what can be done differently or better?
Okay. The first responsibility is the business themselves. You have to go out there and look for information. You can't just sit down in your office and expect information to walk to you. There's several apps. I was found by a gentleman who just reached out to me and said he used an app that provides him with a directory of information. I was really, really bold by that, that there's an app that helps, businesses find opportunities. So that first responsibility yourself. Second is, let me start with stakeholders like us, the Impact Investors Foundation, National Advisory Board. We put out there a lot of information. We gather information, we map the ecosystem, and we try to share that information with the market. Can it be better? Oh, yes, it can be better. One of the things that we can do is to have a system where this information gets to the frontline enterprises. And that's what we are trying to do with our enterprise support collaborative, with over 220 enterprise organizations supporting thousands of business across Nigeria. So we are cascading that information to that community so that businesses and business information gets beyond just Lagos and Abuja, the Bank of Industry, the Development Bank of Nigeria through their PFIs, the participating financial institutions, reach out to businesses that are customers of this bank. And it's important to go to your bank and ask what opportunities are there that comes through government agencies like the BOI and the DBN, and see if you qualify. So the first responsibility still lies in the businesses to find out what's going on in the market. And I think the final one too is to be part of a network. There's so many business network and associations out there. So any business who is really serious in raising capital must be a part of this network, and keep yourself open to information that will be helpful for you to have access.
So there's this lively debate, and I'm sure you've been part of some of these, on whether impact investing can really target the bottom of the pyramid, because it's focused on returns and impact. Sometimes it seems to target more like the middle of the pyramid and not the deep end where poverty lives. What's your view on this? Because one argument is that that's the right approach. They should start by working with the middle and then over time work with the real bottom of the pyramid. Some others are arguing that no, if you're really an impact investor, you should be targeting the bottom and get them to scale up to middle, etc. Where do you fall in that debate?
Very interesting question. How do I start that response? Bottom of the pyramid is where there is gold at the bottom of the pyramid, very important too. And the question we'll ask is, what kinds of capital should go towards the bottom of the pyramid? Should it be commercial capital? And a question I ask, and I'll ask you, Patrick, would you want your capital to go to the bottom of the pyramid where you know is risky and may not want to get the returns? So we must have a strategy of how and which kinds of capital across the capital continuum that should go to the bottom of the capital, catalyze or discover the goal, bring them up to a point where you can now have commercial capital. So in the impact economy, you have all sorts of capital. You have the philanthropic capital. The philanthropic capital should be used strategically to get to the bottom of the pyramid. Very important. And the second layer are cheaper capital that are catalytic to go to areas where to de-risk investment or opportunities for commercial capital to come in. So the bottom of the pyramid level where capital should go are those cheaper finances or closer to philanthropic funds to go and unlock the opportunities there. But let me also add one thing I mentioned earlier on. In a market where the systems are not working, there's something missing, and that's policy. Policy does three things. Policies increase the flow of impact capital, particularly from institutional investors who can invest with long-term, long-tenured, cheap capital. Secondly, policy can increase the demand for impact investment. And government can play a role to signal demand where impact capital should go through incentives. So policy is not playing a role here to help direct capital even to priority sectors. And that's the role of policy. So in a market where you have a certain percentage of your populace at the bottom of the pyramid, capital must be strategic. Policy must be strategic, bringing key stakeholders to the table with definite, clear role in what everyone is playing. The government has its role is playing, either as a market participant or a regulator or a facilitator. You have development finance coming in to catalyze, but development finance institutions should not take over the role of the government or take over the market. You have, thirdly, your investors, your local institutional investors also participating, clear rules for them. And your other private sector investors, clear rules that they should be playing. And finally, you have the capital. And what is the role of the government to help bring in some level of rationality around how things are done in the market and how things are interacting from the mobilization of capital as it intersects with policy and other actors? That's the kind of market where you see monies move the way it ought to go, to where it is needed with the most impact.
So, Etemore, as I listen to you, I feel like, an ardent member of your church, because I have heard this message a few times and I've seen you deliver this message at the highest levels in Nigeria. My question, therefore, is why is the message not getting across? You're clearly in the room. You're clearly respected in the room. The points you're making are cogent. They are sensible to anyone who hears them. What's the problem? Why aren't we able to understand that policy must be in place and must lead? And why, yes, the government says that they're fiscally constrained, but we know that monies are being spent on some other things, which, not your view, but in my view, may not be the best places that we should be putting monies. Why is this thing not adding up, from your experience, and what can be done differently?
Thank you very much again for that very important question. Somebody is listening, but the question is, why aren't actions taken as they listen? So there is a gap somewhere, and it's something that we don't have to give up. We need to keep engaging with them. And I'll tell you this, Patrick.
Yeah, but we need to understand why they are not moving, though. So I understand that we need to keep engaging. So my question is, in your view, why aren't they moving?
Let me tell you some things that have worked. Let me tell you some things, because it's not all doom and gloom, right? It's not all doom and gloom in terms of what the government should be doing. We want it faster. That's the truth. But I cannot tell you. But one of the things I know is policy inconsistency. We've seen that happen. So policy inconsistency, somebody comes into government and says, hey, look, impact investment is great, and I would like to support impact investment. And then another person comes into power and then doesn't see impact investment or sustainable finance as the silver bullets that can stop development issues. So policy inconsistency is a problem until we get to a point where the government becomes a facilitator by putting in, taxonomies that clearly defines what sustainable finance is, what impact investment is, this is what is supposed to be done, giving confidence, to the market. That is important for the government to do. Secondly, there must be regulations. There's no regulations. So when a government comes in and says, I'm supporting this course or this work, like the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund, it must be backed by legislation, and that institutionalizes it. We do not want the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund to be the only fund in the market that is impact focused. We want a proliferation of other funds, instruments in the market that gives confidence and credibility to institutional investors to invest in, particularly with the increase in investment in alternative assets as a fiduciary guidelines that really moves money into these opportunities, these alternative assets. That is what we are not seeing. So that's some of the reasons why we are not seeing the progress in the impact investment space. Local investors are not investing. We are leaving it to DFIs. DFIs are dominating our markets. And for any serious market, you need to have local capital taking the leadership in their own development, but that's not the case in Africa. That's not the
Sure.
case in Nigeria. And so that needs to change.
So let me push this one more time, Etemore. Let me push it one more time. So development literature says recognizes policy inconsistency, and it advises that if you want to do policy, get the bureaucrats involved because governments may come and go, parties may change, but the bureaucrats will stay there and should continue those policies. With the Wholesale Impact Investment Fund, we had government, and again, it was designed under an APC government, different presidents, but APC government. APC takes over again, so it's the same government. It should be the same policies. It was designed with the bureaucrats. They were involved in the design. What broke? Because what I'm trying to understand is that there's something here that we need to understand that could advance development literature, because development literature doesn't really understand the issues that we're dealing with here. That you can have the same party in government, policy designed by the same party takes over, the bureaucrats have not changed. What may have changed is the political leadership at the ministry. But why is it that the party that took over from this, the government that took over from their same party did not continue with the policy, or did not give it the full force it needs to get to the next level? Because if the government does not show its own stake, the local investors that we're hoping that will come through will not come through. So I'm just trying to understand, because I think this could be an important space that is still missing within development literature.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I will only answer as much as I believe, because I don't read minds, but I look at body language and and profession of individuals. I see the profession that we are interested. We will do this. From the previous political leader of government to this new one, there was a handover. You are part of that process. This Wholesale Impact Investment Fund, it's great. It is going to catalyze investment and growth, across Nigeria. It's aligned with the then National Development Plan. We are all for this, and gave us their buy-in and their commitments. But we have still not seen capital move. So it goes back to political will. Is there a political will to do this? One, that's the first question. Secondly, are they waiting for to see traction? And that has been the case in many sectors and industry. We've seen that happen in the creative industry. In the creative industry, policy and regulation is now trying to do catch up. We've seen that with the startup ecosystem. So we're asking ourselves, is this what is happening now? So two things is, one, political will. There may be something around political will which we need to dig in a little bit deeper. Secondly, they might be looking for traction. And so we are not waiting. We have engaged development DFIs from other countries. And let me add that DFI's money is some other government's money. It's not money just on the street. It's another government money who is taking the place of Nigerian government. But they are happy to provide that anchor financing to lock additional capital from the private sector, which means going back to the drawing board and changing the model to fit how we can catalyze the finance institutions to partner with us in catalyzing financing from the private sector. So that's where we are in right now. Government is still on the sideline, being very involved, introducing us to partners and saying, hey, look, we are constrained, but we are behind you. In itself is great commitment. It's good commitment to know that the government is beside you on this journey, introducing you to partners, but saying that, look, we'll do what we can until such a point where we can be resourced.
Etemore, this question is really about measurement, right? And it's, how do you measure additionality in the Nigerian context where baseline data is unreliable or totally absent? How do you avoid attributing impact that would have happened anyway?
Thank you. I'll give you real examples of what investors have done, who were trying to establish, the impact that they were creating and the additionality that they were trying to bring into their capital. It starts by just creating your own. Many data, I would say that, let me backtrack again. So this particular investor that was investing in the renewable energy space needed data and couldn't get data, reliable data. They had to invest in establishing a baseline for themselves within the renewable energy. They were able to create a midline data, midline to see where the progress had happened from when they started from point 2 in 2019. So people are investing in having their own data. And it's important because they have investors who are investing and they want to see progress. They want to see raw data. So we do not have widely available data in the market that are reliable. Other sources are the NBS, the National Bureau of Statistics. People often rely on the NBS for some kind of data as long as it's relevant to yourself. So, I mean, that's in terms of data, you have to invest in establishing your own baseline and, do the rest yourself. Expensive, but it's something that people are trying to address so that data is available for more efficient allocation of resources in the impact investment space here.
So basically, the businesses have to establish their baseline. Is there anyone who's providing guidance on what some of those baseline could be? Obviously, there are different frameworks for measuring impact. Is there anyone who's saying to the businesses, okay, here is how you measure impact. If you're going to set up a baseline, these are the kinds of things you want to measure? Or again, are we leaving it to the businesses to figure it out?
No, there are globally recognized tools and frameworks that you can use to measure and report your impacts with credibility. The first one, which is, everyone can use, same language that we speak across the world, is Sustainable Development Goals, your SDGs. They have indicators and things that you can use to just track, the progress, or matrices you can use to track your progress. The SDG is a great tool to use. The UNDP, United Nations Development Program, designed something they call the SDG Impact Standard, built around the SDGs. It's a framework that any business can use, even fund managers. They have ones for fund managers, they have for OECD countries, they have for small businesses as well. And that framework helps you to build in an internal corporate behavioral change that helps you, not just say you are achieving SDGs, but you're actually, incorporating it through from the board level to the management level to the governance level and how you report it. And in terms of reporting, you have various tools to report. You have the GRI, the global, I'll get the name now, GRI, I call it GRI so many times. You have that framework to help you with reporting. There's now the ISSB, which you can also, the International Sustainability Standard Boards, and the S1 and S2 disclosures that you can use in terms of reporting. There's the Gene Iris Plus. I love the Global Impact Investing Iris Plus, which is so easy to use. You go to their website, you register, and then you ask you some questions around your goals, your impact goals, and then they come up with a thesis for you. So as a business, you can identify your priorities and start tracking. So you can establish your baseline of what you want to track from the point one you start with, and then, you keep, tracking the results up to a point where you can see real progress happen. So these are tools that can be used, and there are lots of trainings, even on Coursera, that businesses and even fund managers can attend, to learn how to track. And we are doing a training on sustainability and how to measure and report your impact in April. So, Patrick, I can share that with you so that if that's okay to share with the rest of the people, for those who want to participate here.
Please do. And most of the trainings are virtual as well. So, people can join, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Absolutely.
but there's this argument, and tell me if you agree with it, that many of these frameworks were designed for Western businesses and have not been properly localized, given our context, etc. Um, how valid is this argument, being that you're really in the space and you deal with it on a daily basis?
SDG is SDG. You can localize it. You have your national what's it called now? Baseline, it's threshold for your industry, which should be your benchmark, whatever industry you are. And then you can use that as a guide to establish the level you would not fall below based on your context, your local context. So that is, a starting point for yourself. And I've seen people who, really adapt, what is important to them. So it's not a straight jacket, it's just always a guide. So some people use their own internal matrices that are important to them and their industry, and match it with other frameworks like the SDGs or the GRI. And those frameworks are just there as a guide. It's not you can't report too much. You can't, but it's important that you are able to understand what is globally recognized, what is important for you, and what your various stakeholders, including your investors, are asking, and ensure that you're reporting that in your report.
Okay, there's a question from Sonny Owolabi, and it's on governance. His question is, how do you navigate the tension between pushing for strong governance practices, and not imposing frameworks that are misaligned with local business culture or institutional capacity? That tension, how do we navigate that?
Thank you. I've seen that happen a lot, particularly with my counterpart here in Ghana with the fund that they are trying to create, and the tussle and toggle, in terms of creating the right governance and framework that is suitable to all partners. One of the things that helps in those situations is bringing everybody to the table and discussing. So you have your one-on-ones. You try to understand where is the tension and what is the cause of the tension, and how do I douse the tension and bring everyone to the table to understand why it's important that the framework of the governance should be like this. And by the time, it's also important for you to establish how important the feedback of your members. So I would maybe ask a little bit more question on from Owolabi, but what has really helped us is bringing people to the table and co-creating. So co-creation has been a very strong way to have stakeholders.
So I've got a question here from Ocha Olai, who I'm sure you know. How can we get more local capital investments into the Nigeria impact investing space? Is there a role that the diaspora can play in supporting the gaps in social investments, especially for priority sectors like health, education, and agriculture? If your answer to the question is yes, what would that look like? Or what would you like it to look like?
That's a long question. So let me take it back so I can answer it in bits. Okay, how can we get more local capital investment into Nigerian impact investment space?
Yes.
Local capital is very important. I mentioned that, and because we cannot keep an over-reliance on foreign capital. One is by policy. It's important that policy really takes a strong space in directing capital from long-term institutions, from investors who can provide long-term investment in the impact investment space. So policy hasn't really taken a leadership in Africa. Some of the strongest markets globally have strong policies where impact investment is recognized as an investment strategy and part of the national development plan. We've seen that in Turkey, we've seen that in Brazil, but we've not seen that in Africa per se. The closest we've seen is in Zambia and in Kenya. In Kenya, they have a taxonomy, a sustainable finance taxonomy that was launched just April of last year. In Zambia, impact investing as an investment strategy as part of their NDP. That in itself is sending a strong signal to the market. It begins to give pension funds the comfort that government has recognized this, as a class that we can mobilize capital into. That is absent in Nigeria. We've not seen that in Nigeria. We've seen the move in Ghana, where pension fund is. So, but what I would say for local capital investment, policy must take that leadership and government should take that role. For diaspora funding coming into play in supporting a gap in social investment, we'll send there are platforms. One of them is being created by the National Philanthropy and Impact Investment office in the office of the vice president, by creating a credible platform where diaspora funds can come in and invest in sectors like you've mentioned, healthcare, education, and agriculture. But that is one in many opportunities that can be created to bring more structure in how diaspora funds come in. What do the diasporans want? Frankly, Patrick, they want transparency. They want accountability. They want credible vehicles and platforms that they can invest in, that they can track and see the progress and impact that their funds are making. But we don't have many of those kinds of platforms. We do have the crowdfunding ones that they give it, but the crowdfunding ones are not enough. So these are some ideas which are that local capital investments can really play a space in the impact investments sector.
By the way, Thelma Akio, who set up the National Philanthropy Office in the VP's office, was a guest on, Development Discourse, and we've got the video on our channel on, how it works. So, so anyone interested can check it out. But let me ask a question that could come in, 2 or 3 parts, and let's take a bit of time to unpack it. So let's assume, Etemore, that you've been invited to completely redesign Nigeria's impact investment ecosystem, from scratch. What would you do? And the question here is, what will you do in terms of policy, which you've touched on a few times, incentives, the different institutions that will play in this ecosystem? So we're going to take them one by one. Let's start with policy. What will you do on policy? And then we'll go to incentives. And then we'll go to the different institutions that need to make up the ecosystem and how they need to interact with each other.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll use a case study in the first one in terms of policy and what has happened to strong markets. Malaysia, I wanted to talk about that. We don't have policies that recognize impact investment as an investment strategy across the continent of Africa. And that hasn't sent a very strong signal to all the actors who play within the space. So the first thing to look at is what has a market like Malaysia done. There's a policy that was launched a few years back called the Social Impact Procurement Program. And that is a national social procurement where the government has used procurement as a strong signal to direct public spending towards social enterprises and impact-driven businesses. What's that done? They have been able to catalyze investments from local investors to investment-ready enterprise who they accredited as viable businesses who procure or purchase from the government, from just about 40 something number of social enterprises that were servicing about 25 ministries, departments, and agencies to thousands of them. By 2030, they estimate to accredit about 5,000 SMEs through that program. So government alone being, sending a signal in the market, directing demands into social enterprises has really helped to catalyze the social enterprise sector. We'd like to see something like that in Nigeria, where policy will be us, how government is interacting with impact investors to build an impact economy in Nigeria. So what I would like to see policy do is for government to really take the leadership, becoming a market participant. Secondly, in terms of policy, government should play the role as a facilitator. Government must facilitate by creating clear taxonomies that defines impact investments, that helps us with strengthening the market infrastructure by supporting and creating infrastructure that not one single person can do. IIF, Impact Investors Foundation, or the National Advisory Board cannot recognize impact investment as an investment strategy. The government can. It sends a strong signal, and it helps the government to identify partners that it wants to interact with. And so that's for policy. Policy too must take a role in terms of incentivizing additional pool of capital from institutional investors. In terms of the asset under management for the pension funds in the trillions of naira, and a huge percentage, about close to 70% of that goes into investment in government timed instruments, government bonds, which should not be. Pension funds should be contributing towards developing the real sector, and that's not happening. So I would like to see incentives that will crowd in local pension funds to participate in the impact investment space. How should different actors be interacting in the space? Great question. There's a lot of silos in the impact investment space. People are, working not collaboratively, but working in such a way that we are not coming together to have a huger impact. I would like government to send signals into the entire market, say these are our priorities, these are priority sectors, and these are the roles that individuals should play. For development finance institutions, this is what we want your capital to do. For investors, these are the priority sectors that we will de-risk with our own finance, and we want you to come in. For pension funds, this is what we want you to do. We want you to invest in alternative assets like private equity, impact investments, and these are the kinds of incentives that we will give you. Governments too must also provide some kind of, I've talked about taxonomy, right? But we must recognize who are impact investors. That definition must be clearly stated. Who are impact enterprises, who are social enterprises, and give them a specific category that identifies the incentive that should accrue to them. In Nigeria, for instance, there is no social enterprise category in the CAC, Corporate Affairs Commission. That must be done. And then we must have some form of accreditation. And finally, impact measurement and management. We need to have a national impact transparency systems where we can accredit impact, where there's data available, for the market. It will help the market to really grow when we have impact measurement and management at the heart of, transactions. So that in itself will really build, a very robust and strong market.
And I have a question from Austin Onele, and I don't know if the answer is what you've just mentioned. He said you've advocated for unlocking pension funds and local institutional capital. I've seen how institutional capital actually operates, the bureaucracy, the political interference, the slow disbursements. Realistically, what institutional infrastructure needs to exist before local capital can be genuinely directed towards impact at scale? And are we anywhere close to having that?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for that question. From my interaction with them, I think one of the things that we must have at is is okay. Well, regulation, the PENCOM has recognized alternative assets as an opportunity or a vehicle that local PFAs can invest in. So there's that awareness. But the question is the fiduciary guidance. There's a lack of fiduciary guidance that kind of holds them responsible and asking them how much of their asset under management has been invested into alternative asset that is not there. So that fiduciary guidance from the regulator is really important to increase the pool of impact capital into alternative assets. Secondly, there must be the opportunities. There are not enough attractive alternative assets out there for pension fund administrators to invest in. So they wouldn't invest if they are not sure of the returns that they are going to get. There's everything in place. There's a long-term capital. So it's not a question of tenure. It's the fact that are there vehicles that are credible, that demonstrate returns, financial returns for the PFAs. So we must create, the markets must create these opportunities with them. I think finally is also engaging with the PFAs. We need to engage with them. While we engage with them, we must understand what their challenges are. We must co-create, we must co-design with them. We must also educate them from their trustees, because some of the pension fund administrators understand they need to invest, but at the end of the day, if the trustees doesn't agree, there's nothing they can do. So we must have education, we must have capacity building at every level. And to add that, alternative assets are very new. The impact funds are new. Impact funds are quite new. So for them to even understand what is impact investment, what is impact fund, what is it trying to seek, what kind of returns are we looking at, and how do we structure our investments into this, opportunity must be something that we must educate the pension funds and get them to be ready to invest, at scale into alternatives opportunities. So some things that we need to prepare the market so we can get local capital and mass, particularly from institutional investors like pension funds. Also insurance too. Insurance is even out of this conversation, but I see that, interest from PFAs, not only in Nigeria, in Ghana, they're really doing exciting things in Ghana, in South Africa as well. But Nigeria, I'm glad that at least less than 1% is being invested into alternative assets. It can grow with the new.
Exactly. And there's a question from Rosalind Okorie, who's an analyst with us. Rosalind's question is, if constraints like a limited pipeline of investment-ready businesses, weak intermediary capacity, and policy barriers that restrict institutional capital were addressed, if we addressed all of these constraints, what would a fully functioning, accessible impact investing ecosystem look like across Africa? So if there was a way for us to address all of these constraints, paint a picture for us on what that impact investing ecosystem could look like and what it could solve for Africa.
Wow, I love that picture. I'd love to paint it. So the huge financing gap of about $331 billion that micro, small, and medium enterprises face on the continent will be, wiped out because we have local long-term capital to put into SMEs. We'll have jobs created because SMEs provide 6% of jobs across the continent of Africa, contributes in Nigeria close to 50% of the GDP. So we'll have a continent where growth is inclusive, where the young people have access to economic opportunities as well as jobs. That's on one level. In terms of the sustainable development goals, where we have depended so much on ODAs, official development assistance, and funds from public sources, will now be funded by the local investors. Impact investing is not charity, but it's very much aligned with SDGs. We'll have basic services, being provided for every African, access to quality healthcare, access to quality education, financial inclusion across the continent. These are some things in terms of infrastructure, which is one thing that we are really suffering in Africa. So impact investment will be solving our infrastructural issues, such as this poor internet that we're suffering with today, logistic problems. I should be able to move to Kenya, South Africa without challenge. And so my goods will be able to move, across the continent, So these are some things that we need to start positioning local capital to be doing, unlocking economic opportunities for every African, for every Nigerian, so that no one is left behind. So it's the future I see.
Fantastic. There's a question here from Dr. Chukuma Okoli. He said, how do we reconcile the need for patient finance and the need to avoid market distortion engendered by such cheap funds, as you alluded to? Some of these patient capital, some of these, capital that we're looking to come in either as grants, etc., could distort the market and create larger challenges. How do we mitigate that?
Well, that's a very important question. I'm thinking so hard because that's our reality in having to balance finance in such a way that we move away from grants funding to more commercial capital. And one way is blended finance. It's important that we have more blended finance structure, particularly when we want to prove a concept. So capital should blend, and capital must blend responsibly. Overt reliance on cheap capital will not help Africa, will not help your businesses. And I'll give you an example of some investors who we have been speaking with to invest in some businesses. One of the reasons why a few of them will not invest in the business is because of their overt reliance on grant financing. So that itself is not attractive to commercial capital. At a national level, our government must be very innovative in looking for ways they can use their powers. We talked about their spend, their investment, talked about their procurement and other ways that they can support enterprise development than providing grant funding. That's a responsibility that requires certain level of discipline at several levels. First, at the government level to avoid grants. Only FIs and for foundations, they are not giving grants as they used to give grants. They want to ensure that if they are giving grants is to set up your operations, set up, or to test your models. But then they want to know that you're going to bring in matching commercial capital. So there's that movement away, and the market is shifting away from grants. So just to add that point.
So let me go to my penultimate question, and it's again from Austin Onele. He says, China has deployed hundreds of billions in green and social capital. He's genuinely curious how they consistently do this. He believes that they may have innovated on the rules of the financial system itself. And you spoke about, Etemore, you spoke about, the government becoming innovative in the way it looks at this issue and the potential solutions. His question is our model structurally capable of achieving the same scale we're seeing in China? Or should we just basically just start copying what China is doing? I don't even know if that's possible. But, that's the question from Austin.
Thank you, Austin, for that question. What I've seen happen in countries like China and Singapore and others is the government's intention in investing massively into research and development, R&D. They spend so much money in ensuring that innovation, research outputs are solving practical problems, and they back it up with, de-risking financing up to a point where commercial capital can come in. And working closely with universities and their what do you call them? Their TTOs, technical transfer offices, to take research from early stages to commercialization to the market where it is ready to scale. We see that in various sectors, even in the electric vehicle sector. I mean, almost every value chain and every sector, the Chinese government started by de-risking and catalyzing that. I don't see our government doing that. And for us to leapfrog and become like China means massive investments, intentional investments by the government in research and development and innovation. So until we do that, we will not leapfrog, we will not scale like China has done across various sectors in their markets.
Let me give you the last word, Etemore. Maybe something that you've been thinking about that we've not touched on in this conversation, or maybe something you just want to re-emphasize.
I like the topic of today's webinar, asking a question, is impact investment a myth? I just want to reiterate that impact investment is not is a fully functioning parallel capital market because of the sheer size of how impact investment has grown globally and is growing at a cumulated average growth rate of 21% and currently valued at 1.57 trillion US dollars. It has its own investors, its own instruments and standards. And if you look at the size of impact investment globally, it's bigger than so many G20 countries. But there are some systemic challenges around impact investments, not, solving how capital moves to the most vulnerable. That's why organizations like the National Advisory Board in Nigerian Impact Investors Foundation, working with partners to collaborate with to ensure that capital moves to the most vulnerable. It's a journey and it's a process that will require all stakeholders to hold hands together to ensure that no one gets left behind. Capital moves at the speed and velocity that is required to create a change that is needed for Nigeria, for Africa, and for the world. It's been an interesting conversation, Patrick. A lot to say, a lot to talk about, but I just think that this is the beginning of conversations and actions that will come out from this engagement.
Exactly. And Etemore, thank you. Thank you for this conversation and for how candid, it's been. You've given us and the audience, something genuinely useful, not just a defense of impact investing, but an honest account of where it's winning, where it's falling short, and what it would take to close that gap. For our listeners, the stakes in this debate are real. Impact investing either becomes a rigorous discipline with clear definitions, like Etemore has said, honest measurement and genuine accountability to the communities where the impact need to be felt. Or it will just become another layer of financial sophistication that leaves the hardest development challenges untouched. Today's conversation has sharpened my thinking on, the way to go. It will help shape an initiative that we're working on in next year, which will be launched in the coming months, that will focus really on bridging the information gap on social innovations across the continent. Etemore Glover, CEO, Impact Investors Foundation, thank you for joining me on Development Discourse. And to our audience, thank you for joining this Development Discourse. Please like, share, subscribe, and stay with us. Until next time, let's keep building that society we want to live in. Etemore, thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Rose, and goodbye, everyone.